Welcome to another episode of Beyond Physical, where we talk about the mental, emotional, social, and at times spiritual benefits of exercise. We believe that exercise is more than movement, and this podcast is our attempt at sharing that message with the world by sharing our own as well as our guests' experiences and knowledge. If you enjoy it, we ask that you please spread the message by leaving a rating and review, or even better, by sharing with a friend. I've been strength training for more than 12 years now. And what started as an adolescent teenager's pretty vain, vanity-driven, gym bro-y pursuit actually turned into something quite beautiful. And the lessons keep coming. As I gain more perspective, live more life, engage in different scenarios, the lessons that strength training teach me, just seem to become richer and richer. And I'm so excited to share that with you today. If you weathered the storm of the hour and 3/4 of Mokisa and I unpacking society's issues around access to health and other economic challenges, I salute you. Job well done. And if you didn't, I totally understand. It was a long chat. And if you haven't, I would recommend listening to it because I thought it was pretty insightful, to be honest. We went back and forth around a whole bunch of cool stuff. That was the last episode. So if that piques your interest, if society, health, access to health, wealth distribution, and how that ties into health interest you, then go and have a listen. But in 12 years, strength training has taught me about life, growth, and fulfillment. And I've got 5 lessons, 5 key takeaways to share with you today. So number 1, strength training teaches us to value process over immediacy, delayed gratification. In other words, the first few years of training, when the results were slow or imperceptible, I kept showing up. And I kept showing up because at the time, I don't think I quite understood the time frame that I was operating within. I think maybe I felt like the results were going to come quicker than initially kind of assumed. But for whatever reason, I did stick at it. And when I reflect on it, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly why I stuck it out. And I often look back and think about younger Seb, and I think to myself, geez, kudos to you, pat on the back, sir, because I'm very grateful for the freedom that strength training affords me and has afforded me over the years to explore and experience all the different things that life has to offer because I am physically able to do so, and to a pretty excessive level in most cases, because as you know by now, that is what I like to do. I like to push the boundaries and stretch the elastic, keep the elastic tight, as my mom used to say. But when you start strength training, after the first workout, after the second workout, after the 12th workout, after the 30th workout, after the 50th workout, you still don't really see extraordinarily noticeable results. A lot of people have this idea, a lot of clients come to me actually saying, Seb, I would love to get a bit stronger and to feel more comfortable in my body, but I don't want to be bulky like you, or I don't want to be as built as you are. And I always have to really think about the best way to deliver the feedback that, unfortunately, or fortunately in their case, actually, that is not how it works. So strength training is not something where you do it for a few months and you wake up and you look like Chris Bumstead. It is something that requires thousands upon thousands upon thousands of repetitions, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of workouts, and in the same breath, years and years and years of watching what you eat and ensuring that you are getting sufficient nutrients and that you are making sure that the fuel you're putting into your body all lines up with where you're trying to go physically. And this can be incredibly disheartening to some people. A lot of people start off, give it a bash for the first 6 months, and then they get discouraged because, yes, they see some beginner gains. Usually, because strength training is novel, your body adapts, it responds favorably, you see some results. But the results come slowly. And I think the transfer of this into life is absolutely limitless, and it's boundless, and it's profound, and it's powerful. And it's because delayed gratification really is a maxim for life. It's if you are interested in pursuing something different or something that you haven't done before, different being relative, different in your personal scenario, you're not going to get there overnight. Some people are born with a slightly better deck of cards genetically. Maybe your propensity to grasp mathematical concepts is better than your peers and you get things quicker. But still, you will eventually get to the point where you're going to have to sit and work through a problem that you don't get immediately. And you're going to have to try over and over and over and over until you get it. And the reward takes a long time to see. And this extends to business, this extends to relationships, this extends to pretty much everything. If it's worth doing, it usually takes a little bit of time. And there's a really famous study that Walter Mischel conducted in the 60s and 70s, which you may know. I'm sure you actually do know. And if you don't know Walter Mischel, you probably know the experiment, which is the marshmallow experiment, where children were given a choice: 1 treat now or 2 treats if they're weighted. Now, small aside, after further research, I did find that there has been some contention around this study, but just for sake of the analogy, I'm going to assume that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the scientific method or how the study was conducted. But follow-up studies showed that kids who were able to wait tended to have better life outcomes, higher SAT scores in the American context, healthier BMI, even better coping skills in adulthood. So essentially, the discipline you build in the gym by showing up today and not expecting to be stronger tomorrow, that mindset translates into every meaningful pursuit in life. Lifting weights in the gym is the marshmallow experiment. Are you willing to suffer now in the short term, to do the hard workout, to expose your body to something different, to push your limits, and to not see a result immediately, to not walk out of the gym and immediately come back 5 minutes later and be able to lift 3 kilograms more than you did in the workout that you just completed? You've got to repeat the workout over and over and over before you actually see a return. So delayed gratification is something that I learned from strength training. And another interesting personal anecdote was I pursued lifting for the first 3 to 5 years, primarily with vanity as the motivation. From age 14, I was lifting in the gym consistently. I'm now 27. Oh, that's 13 years. I'm now 27. And for the first 3 years, it was primarily vanity. I just wanted to get more muscular, and I wanted that because I thought I'd feel better about myself physically if I was more muscular. And 2 or 3 years in, I started to see a little bit of traction in my rugby career, my kind of very amateur rugby career, and was put into a couple of high-performance squads. And that then shifted my training a little bit more towards performance and not primarily vanity. But 5 years in, I had reached somewhat of a plateau, which is quite normal. And because I was so focused on performance, I was looking at metrics like my bench press. And my bench press probably stayed the same for about a year and a half, 2 years. And I eventually re-looked at the way that I was training my bench press, and I had a breakthrough. And that's another little tidbit around delayed gratification. You might not have the answer to the problem right now, but if you stick at it long enough, you expose yourself to the problem long enough, you apply different potential solutions to the problem. You know, the first time, maybe it doesn't work. The second time, it doesn't work. The third time, it doesn't work. But then the fourth time, you have a breakthrough, and that feels amazing. And that's all really about persistence and knowing that it's not the be-all and end-all that you progress right now today, but that you stick at it long enough until you figure out what is going to take you to the next level. Lesson number 2 building a foundation. So a foundation creates freedom. And in the context of strength training, I have found that because I spent the better part of a decade doing strength training consistently, I was really able to freely experience and explore other types of movement when I stopped playing rugby, namely running, distance running, which was something entirely unfamiliar to my body. Growing up, I was a sprinter, I was a field athlete, I did shot put, javelin, long jump, 100, 400, much more explosive types of movement, and I always labeled myself as not a distance runner. And that is primarily why I embarked on this whole running journey. I was at a crossroads after finishing rugby, thinking to myself, I want to try something that I am no good at and that I can be a beginner at and I can improve at, because I love the experience of improvement. I love the experience of progress. I love the experience of growth. That whole process is something that I find incredibly stimulating and rewarding. I love measuring things. I love tracking things. I love seeing incremental gain and troubleshooting little sticking points, like I did with the bench press and like I've done in business and like I did with academics and other various elements of my life. I find that the most fulfilling part of any journey is getting to a hurdle and figuring out that you can't really jump the hurdle the way you thought. Maybe you've got to kind of adapt the rules a bit and go around the hurdle, or maybe go under the hurdle, or try something better suited to how you approach the thing that can get you to the next point along the race. But anyway, to bring us back to building a foundation, strength training has formed a very robust, broad, and sturdy foundation for me to explore other types of movement. I've also recently started experimenting with jiu-jitsu, and I've found that my body has coped with that relatively well because I am strong and because I have this certain level of resilience that strength training has afforded me to expose my body to different things. You can only build as high as your foundation when it comes to construction. A cottage and a skyscraper require very different foundations. It's kind of like, another analogy would be like with maths. So when you're doing arithmetic in the formative years of your academic life, you are laying foundations, you're putting in the building blocks. And as many of you will have experienced, what I experienced, is sometimes if you brisked over a certain concept because it really wasn't talking to you or you were struggling with it, eventually down the line, it might be 6 months later, it might be 6 years later in a high school final exam, that foundational vulnerability exposes you, and you then don't have the freedom to engage with that problem because you haven't laid the foundations as robustly as you should have. So to tie it back to strength and conditioning, Kramer and Ratames published a comprehensive paper in 2004 on strength training fundamentals, highlighting how foundational strength, lower body, core, upper body, is critical not just for athletic performance, but also for longevity, injury prevention, and metabolic health. If you look at sports and high performance setups in general, there are so many different avenues that one can go down. You could be a horse rider, you could be a golfer, you could be a footballer, you could be a rugby player, you could be a table tennis player. No matter the vehicle you choose or the avenue you choose, foundational strength is a key component of this. It's going to allow your body to interact with whatever stimulus that sport applies to your system, to your body, much more freely, much more robustly, much more resiliently, and with a lot more freedom, as I like to say. And there are fundamental components and foundational elements of strength that are pretty ubiquitous for performing in sport. And this foundation really acts as a concept and as an analogy for life as well. When we talk about strength as a foundation, we're not just talking about lifting heavier, we're talking about quality of life, resilience, the ability to play longer and harder, physically and mentally. So it really taught me and has really shown up for me recently in Horizon, because understanding that we are in this very, very early stage. I mean, we're only 3 years in, which is, in the business world, it is, we're a baby. And making sure that the foundations are right it's oftentimes a lot more important than how fast you move. Yes, moving quickly is incredibly important, but moving quickly in the right direction and with the right foundations and systems in place is importanter. Lesson number 3 is understanding intensity. Now, this one for me is probably the most applicable throughout life, and I think it jumps out at me quite a lot because my mom had this ism called "keep the elastic tight," and I call it a Carolism because my mom's name was Carol. And I actually posted about it in LinkedIn. I did a short series on LinkedIn where I explored various teachings that my mom shared with me. I unpacked them, I reflected on them as part of my grieving process, and I shared those lessons on LinkedIn. And keeping the elastic tight basically means no matter where you are, no matter what level you're at, no matter how early or how far on you are into your journey, stretch yourself. And stretch yourself properly. Take yourself to your limits, because there are one of two things that can happen. Maybe one of three. The first thing, you stretch the elastic too hard, the elastic breaks. Then you understand you've reached a limit. And if you reach a limit, it benchmarks where you can take yourself in that moment. And then you understand what work needs to be done in order to move past that limit. And I think that is incredibly helpful. If I have to bring it back into strength training, at the beginning of any training block or pre-season for the rugby days, we would do max testing, 3 rep, 1 rep, maximum fitness, yo-yo test, etc. And for pretty much every test, if you did them properly, you would take yourself to failure. So as heavy as you possibly could go, or as long or as far as you possibly could go, until your system just said no, and you couldn't continue any further. And what this did was it allowed us to understand, okay, this is where we're at. These are the vulnerabilities. And with that information, we could understand what work needed to be put in, how much work needed to be put in, and what the timeline might look like for getting to where we want to be. You only find the edges of your capability by going a little too far. That's where the learning happens. The second bit about, or outcome around keeping the elastic tight, is the elastic might stretch to the point that you didn't expect it to stretch, and it doesn't break. And with that, you have an understanding of, oh wow, my capabilities are actually greater than I initially thought, which is a great confidence boost. And it's also information that informs that you probably could take things a little bit further if you wanted to, which is incredibly valuable information too. And to support this with a little bit of academia, Mokisa would be proud. Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues in 2016 published a research on training to failure, showing that higher effort levels near failure stimulate greater hypertrophy, so muscle building, and neuromuscular adaptation. So basically your brain and your muscles working in accordance with one another and communicating effectively, especially for intermediate and advanced lifters. So as you progress, actually, it becomes more and more important to test your limits, because you need to understand where you're at. And in order to achieve incremental improvement, you need to put in progressively more effort, which can sometimes be a little bit daunting, but it's also quite exciting, because you find out that you have this capacity to go further, and you've actually got to exercise that in order to keep the dial moving. So whether it's training or business or relationships, you've got to take yourself to the limit now and then to understand your bandwidth. Without that, you're just guessing. You're not actually working effectively. You're not actually training effectively. You're not actually communicating effectively. Without trying to take things past the point that you have taken it before or taken them before, you can't make an informed decision around whether or not that effort is sufficient. And understanding your limits is key to figuring out what intensity level you need to work with. So understanding intensity is a really important and helpful kind of tool that I've learned from strength training around its application to life. And to dive a little bit deeper into this too, I was having a session with a friend of mine, Spencer, the other day, and we were doing a more hypertrophy-focused workout, and I was explaining to him the methodology that Dorian Yates used to use when he was bodybuilding. Dorian Yates, 6-time Mr. Olympia, absolute freak show monster. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably don't want to emulate Dorian Yates, but he had some really, really insightful points on exercise and on training. And that was basically, he would train 4 times a week, sometimes 5 times a week, because I think it was every other day, which sometimes is 4 times a week, sometimes is 5 times a week, because it's a 7-day week, but correct me if I'm wrong. And a lot of people will say, geez, well, how does he, if you have no idea who he is, pause the podcast and go and research him. And you'll say to yourself, how did this person achieve this level of muscular development and strength by training 4 times a week? Like that doesn't sound like a lot. But when you are training with sufficient intensity, which he did, you are physically actually incapable of recovering quickly enough to do more than that. And for me, that is a great yardstick to kind of pin your intensity levels against. You've got to work to the point where a rest becomes self-apparent, where the system gives you the feedback and it takes the guesswork out of it, because you can intuitively feel when you need to dial it back. And that, for me, is when you know you've put in a good shift. When you get home after a day of work or a day of whatever it is that you may be doing, you have your dinner or whatever it may be, you have a shower and you collapse into bed and you're like, wow, that was a shift. This sleep is going to be phenomenal. That is sufficient effort. There's no better feeling than that. And that is when you know that you're putting in enough to actually see some sort of result. So when I was training with Spencer, to bring it back to that anecdote, I told him that I felt nervous for the top set. And he said, why do you feel nervous, Seb? And he said, are you nervous because you think you're going to get injured? And I said, no, I'm not nervous that I'm going to get injured. I'm nervous because I know how uncomfortable this is going to be. And I saw immediately the novelty in his eyes around, geez, I don't think I've been exposed to a weight session where there were nerves involved. And for me, that is exactly the point that you want to be at psychologically when you're lifting weights, in order to determine that your working set is challenging enough. Now, small aside, if you are doing strength training with the primary goal of getting stronger, so not hypertrophy, you're not trying to volumize cells, you're not trying to build muscle tissue, you're not doing hypertrophy, you're doing strength specific, so things from 1 to 5 reps, then the nerves don't necessarily have to be there unless you're doing a 1 rep max. Then of course you're taking yourself to maximal effort, nerves make more sense. But typically with strength training, as I explained to Spencer, you'll be looking to work for maybe 3 to 5 sets, 1 to 5 reps. These will all be predetermined, and you'll have it at maybe 85 to 90% of your 1 rep maximum, depending on the rep range that you're working in. And the goal for this is for every rep of every set from beginning to end to look identical. It's quality, it's execution, it's form, it's repeatability. And this is slightly different to hypertrophy training. And this sometimes doesn't come unless when it's a 1 rep maximum with that element of nerves. So take the nerves thing with a pinch of salt. It doesn't necessarily apply to strength training in its pure kind of high performance form. It's more so when you're looking at hypertrophy. And to go further down the rabbit hole, why is hypertrophy classified under the same bracket as strength training? Because typically cross-sectional area of muscle mass, so the size of the muscle, correlates to greater force generation potential of the muscle. In other words, the more muscle mass you have, the more potential strength you have to generate from that muscle. And that is why hypertrophy training forms a key component of strength training. Although it is not specifically aimed at building strength in the immediate training effect sense, it is a key component to a larger macro cycle of building overall foundational strength. If you look at a strength program that is for a high-level athlete or somebody who's trying to get as strong as humanly possible, they will spend a portion of that or a block of that or maybe 2 blocks of that focused specifically on building muscle tissue. Because then when they go into their more absolute strength-focused block, they have more muscle mass to work with. So that is just an aside and a disclaimer around feeling nervous to do a set. But anyway, back to the conversation with Spencer. So he looked a little bit confused that I was saying I was nervous because the set was going to be uncomfortable. But I felt like that was a key cue to understand when doing hypertrophy training where you want to be intensity-wise in order to stimulate and invoke a muscle building response from your body. You want to feel like going into this set, oh my goodness, this is going to be so awful, but in such a beautiful way. I feel quite nervous. It's going to be super uncomfortable. And Spencer's a runner predominantly at the moment. So the analogy I drew for him, and if you are a runner, this might resonate with you, it's, have you ever done a threshold workout? So what is a threshold workout? You typically can't speak in coherent sentences when you're doing a threshold workout. And the kind of physiological explanation or the biochemical explanation around a threshold workout is you are working or training or exerting yourself at an intensity that, or let me take us a step back. To define threshold, it's basically the intensity at which you are performing where the accumulation of lactate in your blood is matching the rate at which your system is clearing the lactate. So you are able to sustain this barely. And once you pass that threshold, you are accumulating lactate quicker than you're clearing it. And that's when you typically would bonk or hit a wall or not be able to continue. Your legs start burning, your lungs start burning. And your system is basically like, we're doing everything we can to get rid of this kind of bio waste or this byproduct of the use of ATP for energy, and which is lactate, and the lactate buildup causes you to struggle to sustain the level of effort. And runners are very familiar with this feeling, and I think a lot of runners, and if you are one, you can relate to, or even if you're just a person that's gone for a hard run, not a zone 2 run, you can relate to the fact or the feeling of going into a run, knowing it's going to be a difficult workout and thinking, shit, I am nervous for this workout. It could be a long workout, or it could be a really intense workout, or it could be a long and intense workout. But that feeling of, shit, this is going to be hectic and I'm nervous, but I know that this is going to be so beneficial because the longer you spend or the more frequently you expose yourself in a controlled and appropriate dose to those kinds of workouts, the better and more efficient your body becomes at clearing lactate. So you can actually move at a more or a higher intensity and continue to sustain it whilst, performing at that level. So you're teaching your body to understand, okay, whilst we're working at this intensity, we need to get rid of this kind of waste product, and we're doing it more effectively than we did previously. So there's a great training benefit to it within a sort of properly periodized and planned program. And those nerves that you have for that's exactly what you want psychologically to mimic in a top set when you're working to enact hypertrophy. and this is kind of the analogy that I drew with Spencer, but keeping the elastic tight, feeling nervous for a top set, these are key things to understanding what your limits are, and from that, understanding what work you need to put in and how you can benchmark your workouts to understand if you are working at a high enough intensity. Now, the next lesson, and this is one that I've engaged with most with business, because having had a lot of time in high-performance sports environments, my understanding for periodization and recovery in that context is quite refined. So I have a good understanding for when personally I should be resting, and I also trust the process around planned rest. So periodization and recovery as a life philosophy. Growth isn't just about the push, it's also about the pullback. So periodization is basically just planned phases of intensity followed by planned phases of rest, to put it in layman's terms. I won't get overly technical, because I think I bored you a bit with the details of hypertrophy training and strength training and intensity. So if you want me to go deeper into periodization, we can get Gideon on the podcast and we can chat about that with you. But for now, I'll just kind of give you the high level of planned intensity followed by planned rest. So using it in your own life, it's basically learning to pull back when you have given that big effort. Remember that big effort that I spoke about in the previous lesson around intensity? When you get that feeling for a prolonged period of time of, man, I've put in a huge shift, and you're feeling that maybe the day is not enough to recover, and you're having this in consecutive days, and you're also feeling a little bit mentally fatigued, your motivation is a little bit eroded, that's when you can probably look at having a slightly longer rest. Personally, I work quite well with 6 to 8, sometimes 12-week sprints, and this is just optimal for me. I would say it's actually more 8 to 12 weeks. 8 to 12 week sprints followed by maybe 1 to 2 weeks of reduced intensity. So when I say sprint, I mean work sprint. I'm not referring to physical sprinting. And reduced intensity, that is the key term. It's not no training, it's not no effort, but it's less effort. And this is really important, because you will put in that big shift, you will be incredibly creatively inspired, you will be very driven, very motivated, really switched on, dialed in, putting in the shifts. When it gets tough, you push through, you hammer away. The next day you go hard again, the next day you go hard again, and you keep that going for your sprint whilst you're in that zone. And then you take absolute rest for 1 to 2 weeks in terms of what you would be usually working at. Now, maybe I should remove the word absolute. You take rest, because obviously in life, it's very rare that you find 1 to 2 weeks every 3 months to just not work. I think for most people, that is both unrealistic and also undesired. I mean, especially when you're doing something you love, I have found this personally, that it is actually harder to rest, because I am so engaged with what I do, and I do find so much enjoyment in what I do, and for the most part it feels like play more than anything else, that learning and understanding and knowing when to take that rest, when to not stretch the elastic so much, is actually difficult, because I would be doing it anyway, even if it wasn't in a work environment. So you've got to remind yourself how important rest is. And it's something quite characteristic of the beginner. And I'll tie this back to the strength training analogy. Most beginners are like, okay, cool, I'm going to go as hard as I can, as often as I can. I'm going to train every day. And then sometimes they start to suffer with a little bit of burnout, and they actually start to see slower progress than they otherwise would have been if they were incorporating 2 rest days a week, or they were incorporating a down week to take it a little bit more, to take a little bit further, which is basically what we're talking about here. But you want to ensure that you are putting in sufficient effort, and then if you don't know when you should be resting intuitively yet, just plan a rest ahead of time, because working without rest, in most cases, you do have anomalies. So politically love him or hate him, this is just an objective statement from Walter Isaacson's biography on him, but Elon Musk is known for just working continuously, and he doesn't really take rest, and that works for him, but he is an anomaly, and that's, I don't think, a model that works for most people. I think most people work better with having periodic rests. There was actually someone in my team, or is someone in my team at Horizon, who is incredibly inspired creatively, contributes tremendous amounts of value to the team, and she's very invested and is a high performer and loves what she does, which is all amazing. But unfortunately, that manifested in poor rest management. And of course, I had a role to play in that. I mean, I encouraged the rest as much as I possibly could, but I didn't enforce it. I guess I don't like being kind of forceful in my management style. But it got to the point where her body told her to rest. And that happens. If you don't pick the rest, your body's going to pick the rest for you, or your mind's going to pick the rest for you. And that's not necessarily a position you want to be in. If you're someone like me who likes to plan things, who likes to be in control, it's better that the rest is on your own terms so that you can also plan around these things. So to bring in another study, Vladimir Isurin, I'm probably butchering his name, wrote extensively on block periodization and the need for planned recovery. He showed that deloads improve long-term adaptation, which is growth, whether it be performance-wise or whatever it may be, and performance by reducing fatigue accumulation. And that exact analogy applies to life. Because through consistent effort, especially if you're working as hard as one would hope to be in order to do something impactful or creative or different, you're going to be working really hard. You're going to be putting in a lot of effort. But the byproduct of effort, as with lactate in the body when you're putting in a hard effort, is fatigue. And you've got to give your system time to clear that fatigue so that you can continue with inspiration, with excitement, with energy. You know, so if you train all out all the time, you burn out. And the same goes for life. And when your work feels like play, like mine does, as I said, most of the time, it's actually harder to rest, but it's even more necessary. And I would definitely rather have the problem of having work feel like play and not knowing when exactly I need to rest than dreading every day of work. But that's not to say that everyone falls on either side of the spectrum, because it is a spectrum, it's a continuum. And you need to learn first through planning your rests and then collecting feedback. And then through intuition, I think. As you become more experienced, you'll notice with athletes that they become quite intuitive with when to take rests. I remember being absolutely amazed hearing from this guy, Julian Dean Brown. He's a really strong trail runner. He told me about how sometimes when he's got a quality session booked in the schedule, so a hard run, whether it's hills or intervals or whatever it may be, and he goes into that workout feeling mentally flat for whatever reason. Maybe he's experienced elevated cortisol levels because he's stressed, or maybe he's just pushed it a little bit harder earlier in the week and for the weeks preceding that in his training block, and now he's more tired than anticipated. If he's going into that workout with the mindset of fatigue and slowness and lethargy, and he starts it off, and the first 15, 20 minutes, he doesn't feel that clearing up, he walks away. He packs it up. He says, okay, cool. I'm going to turn this into an hour easy, or I'm going to turn it into a 45-minute easy, or I'm going to take my shoes off altogether. But he can only do that because he's been doing periodized block-style training for years, and he has an understanding of when to rest and when to push. So you've kind of got to earn the right to train intuitively and to work intuitively, as with other elements of life. It's got to start as something planned for the most part until you fully understand what works for you. I found that typically 4-week training blocks work best for me. I could probably sometimes do with 3-week training blocks because of the intensity that I train at. But I typically know come the end of the 3rd week, that Thursday session, that Friday session, that Saturday session, that Sunday session before I go into the deload are a push. And I know that the down week is coming at the right time for me because I've done it hundreds of times over the past decade. Next, one that really excites me, the next lesson number 5, and the final lesson is adaptation means embracing the unfamiliar. Growth only happens when you introduce novelty. So just like with strength training, in life, familiarity means you've already adapted. Growth demands newness. If something is familiar, it means that your mind or your body or your being, you are accustomed to that thing. And if you're accustomed to that thing, it's not going to facilitate or demand any sort of adaptation, because that is what growth is. Growth is an adaptation to something that you haven't previously dealt with before. That's why typically in life you find when you go through something challenging, you grow, you adapt. And if you don't grow or adapt, you can be buried by that thing. You can be buried by that challenge. You can be buried by that situation, or that breakup, or that death in the family, or that injury that you've picked up. But every setback is an opportunity to reflect, learn, and grow. And that is such an exciting thing. It's the same thing with every time you fail a rep in the gym, it's either because your form was not quite where it needed to be, or because you're not quite strong enough yet. And that is simply feedback showing you that you've got work to do. You've got some reps to put in. And that is the exact same thing with life. Trying different types of movement. When I started off with running, this new jiu-jitsu journey, they all triggered growth because they are so unfamiliar and because they expose the system to something that the system hasn't had to adapt to before. It's new data, it's new inputs, new variables that have to be factored into the model for surviving and thriving under those conditions, which is what growth is all about. It's about figuring out what variables there are in front of you and how to get to the outcome that you're looking for, which a lot of the time is just survival. But there are positive externalities to navigating these situations, like having a new skill set that you didn't have previously. And if it doesn't always seem apparent in the moment, it's at least a cue that you can mentally give yourself to say, look, I've been in this situation before. I've navigated difficult things before, and I have a new insight as a result of that. And because of that, I have grown. Dragansky et al. In 2006 conducted a study where participants learned to juggle. Brain scans showed increases in gray matter in areas associated with motor activity and visual motion processing. But here's the catch. When they stopped juggling, that gray matter shrank again. So when they stopped exposing themselves to the challenge, to the new stimulus, atrophy occurred, as it would in the gym. It's in the same breath as if you expose yourself to a new stimulus, to new weights, to new intensity, to new rep ranges, if you hang out in that zone of unfamiliarity for long enough, adapt. But then if subsequently you don't continue to expose yourself to the same or new kinds of stimulus, you can often regress. So it's a continuous pursuit. It's a continuous either renewal or preservation of what it is that you are trying to achieve. And as Phil Knight said, life is growth. Without growth, if you're not growing, you're dying. And that's because all other things do not remain the same. Nothing is static in the world. Everything is moving and changing and moving and changing and progressing rather. And if you remain in the same position, the rest of life and the rest of the world is going to continue moving forward. I mean, this is a perfect example, is that kid in high school who was this kind of phenom at sport, and they, subsequent to that, didn't put in any sort of effort around really taking the sport to the next level, or maybe other areas of their life. And what was at that stage this amazing level of achievement and this amazing level of competence and ability, relatively speaking, 10 years down the line, is really not really kind of even worthy of comment, because they have remained unchanged and everything else and everyone else has moved forward. So it's a harsh reality, but it's a really poignant and important point to take away from strength training. If you want to progress, you must expose yourself to new things, to harder weights, to different challenges, to new problems. And this is actually the most amazing thing that you can engage in, is new things, because it's what causes growth. It's what causes adaptation. Familiarity means that you've already adapted. If you are familiar with the thing, you have already adapted to the thing. Growth demands newness. So in other words, our brains and bodies grow through exposure to new challenges. If you want to grow, you have to do things you're not already good at. You have to be a beginner. And if you stop being challenged, you start regressing. And again, to tie in another business analogy, at the Amazon headquarters, they have a sign that says day one. And that's because they are in this perpetual mindset of a beginner. And there is profound beauty in that notion, because it means that there's always something to learn and there's always newness. You've just got to be open to seeing it, open to exposing yourself to it, and then open to walking the path of beginner to maybe not so beginner, someone who understands it a bit, and depending on how long you sit and work through that challenge, maybe becoming an expert. And I think it's a very natural human inclination to want challenges. Most of the people that I know that are unsatisfied with their professional lives are feeling that way because they don't feel sufficiently challenged. And it's a weird one, because you've got to take the immediate discomfort in order to feel the fulfillment. Coasting through life eventually leads to boredom. And I think we are hardwired to desire and crave novelty. And that sometimes manifests in negative ways, where we task jump and we don't actually spend long enough on a specific thing to see any notable progress. But inherent to our nature is just wanting to do things that are new. And I think that is just an existing instinct within us that should be leveraged to really live a fuller life and to not regress and to become a better version of yourself, to become a more full, happy, and whole version of yourself. So to recap, the 5 lessons I've learned over the past 12 years of strength training about life and business and everything in between. Delayed gratification. Work now, don't expect immediate results, and the progress will come. Prioritize the process over the result in the near term. Build your foundation. Strength is a metaphor for life. Foundational strength allows more freedom to explore new things. That applies to whatever it is that you are working towards. Lay your foundations, take your time, be meticulous with that. Don't rush it, because the foundations for a skyscraper are very different to the foundations for a cottage. Find your edge. Keep the elastic tight, as my mom would have said. Keep pushing yourself. Figure out what your limits are, because that informs how you work, what you work on, and in which direction you work, as well as the intensity of your work. Periodize your effort. Plan your rests. And once you've planned your rests for long enough and you can exercise intuition and you've earned that right to use intuition, you're in a good spot. But make sure to plan your rest. If you want to remain energized and creatively inspired and driven and excited, plan your rest. And rest doesn't mean no work, or it doesn't have to mean no work. If you're someone that likes to keep busy, you can still work, just work at a lower intensity, because that's what we do in strength and conditioning. Absolute rest often happens maybe once in a season, once in a year. But on the more mesocycle side of things, it's, doing these periodized lower effort spurts. And seek the unfamiliar. look for new things, look for different things, expose yourself to new challenges. And that doesn't have to be something totally different from what you already do. It can just be something new within your existing field, because familiarity means that you've already adapted. And adaptation is growth, and growth requires newness. So I have a small homework assignment for you. Take it as you will, but I encourage you to reflect and figure out where you are resisting discomfort or novelty. Zone in on that thing, figure out where it fits into your life, and whether or not creating a little bit of novelty or discomfort in that area might benefit you. And what phase of your periodization are you in? Are you in need of a rest? Do you need to plan a rest, or do you have a few more weeks to push before you need to rest? Understand your rest cadence. We spoke a couple of weeks ago about rest cadence. I think it was 2 episodes ago. So go have a listen to that. The importance of that is really paramount to achieving fulfillment and to achieving performance. And if you want a little bit more of a deep dive on that, I encourage that you go listen to that episode. So strength training taught me to lean into what's hard, to rest intentionally, and to never stop adapting. It taught me that the physical is just the entry point. The real gains happen beyond physical. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you've got any questions. Happy to answer them. And if there's anything that you want us to chat about in the next episode or episodes to come, please pop me a DM on Instagram at Sprenner, or DM the Horizon Instagram at HorizonZA, or pop me an email at sebastian@horizongym.com, and I'll be happy to have a chat. But until we talk next time, this is Beyond Physical, and thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to the show, guys. We love answering specific questions. So if there's anything you want to know, leave a comment or reach out to us directly at HorizonZA on Instagram, or email us at movement@horizongym.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Seb Prentice, and this is Beyond Physical.